Hello, this is Johnnie Porter. I am a marriage and family therapist student for North Central University, and I am going to talk regarding dynamics of family interaction. And this week's assignment is I'm tasked to imagine the American Association for Marriages and Family Therapy, which is the AAMFT, has asked me to create a video blog for marriage and family therapists, uh, educating them about divorce-related legal processes and uh, ethical considerations regarding the role of marriage and family therapists in these processes. So, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the general divorce process, what that means, uh, how do you go about that in general, and we're going to talk about child custody. We're going to talk about we're going to look at the considerations for evaluating child custody arrangements or mental health of the caregiver, and how do we place those children in custody based off of the information. How do we assess them? Not only just the family, but the children as well. We're going to look at all of that. We want to consider the AAMFT codes of ethics. We're going to look at those as well as it relates to our subject that we're talking about today, and different tips for releasing information when we're subpoenaed as therapists. And I've never really had that happen to me. In fact, that's been one of my biggest concerns or fears as far as being an expert witness or something like that. But anyway, let's talk about the general divorce process. All right, and the potential role of marriage and family therapists. The role that a marriage and family therapist can play during a divorce or custody proceeding requires that professionals understand their role. Number one, the divorce process is pretty complicated in itself. Let me take my glasses off because it's getting a glare and I can't really read my notes here. But divorces are happening quite often more, and what we have to do as therapists is try to protect our clients' interests and protect their information. And I'm kind of all over the place, so let me kind of start over. The divorce process itself is where parents are splitting, and the family system is no longer working, and so the divorce process happens where the whole family system is compromised, and children are usually involved, but the couple is no longer choosing to remain together, and so the rise of divorce rates are often rendering children and adolescents to become innocent victims in an adult-centered conflict, which is a decision made by two adults who are no longer choosing to be together. These are parents who are unwilling to negotiate child custody concerns, and they're not willing to do that without having some kind of legal representation. Divorce and child custody as a result of a divorce is basically one of those things that that are on the rise, really. And I don't have the numbers to say, but per some of my reading, I was reading some information by L. Spurry, his 2012 article titled "Family Assessment: Contemporary and Cutting Edge Strategies." As for dealing with family assessments, we see that there are some numbers, and there is also a real important need to evaluate the entire family when you're dealing with divorce-related issues. So, in order to best serve the needs of the client and to protect their interests, it is essential for mental health professionals, providers, to understand the context in which conflict is being addressed. Now, it is important that the marriage family therapist should understand adversarial negotiations where they can become hostile, or maybe there is some abuse history involved. But they have to understand that the therapist also has to understand uh, how a couple can be cooperative or adversarial. As I said, it can be aggressive. Um, Therapist involvement in the litigation arena may take various forms, and that means that the therapist needs to understand how to navigate and how to be involved in this process. And so the general divorce process itself, it can be long term. It can cause a lot of damage. In fact, we find that in some of this week's reading that a lot of families can experience a second level of trauma as a result of having been exposed to the legal system. And even some children can even become almost hostage, like when they're stuck into foster care. And so the actual that divorce process is, it can be tough. And so when you look at divorce process and you especially got a family with children, it then looks into child custody, who gets the child, who's the most responsible person. And so there are a lot of legal considerations that must take place in this process. Now, legal mediation for couples opting to end their marriage places the mental health professional in the middle of this dispute. And this happens when attorneys want to call therapists in to do discovery, investigations to find out what was going on in the family, to see who's going to be the best person for the children to live with. And so when legal mediation for these couples begin to happen because they can't figure out what they want to do, the therapist is brought into this thing. And this is certainly the case when it involves children and assets. The need for good documentation along with communication is extremely essential for the therapist to make notes. And there are different little things that you can deal with that will help you with that. I was reading an article by Rachel Verk, and it was titled "The Roles for the Therapist in Divorce and Custody Proceedings and Important Legal Consideration." And it was actually a good read. And I think another book was dealing with the 4 ways of divorce, which can be found on Amazon. There was another book here by Rachel Verk as well, she wrote. And it just offers a lot of different things and talks about how the therapist should be aware that his or her testimony, if you are called in to provide that type of support, is so important. Because when I started the assignment this week, I was trying to figure out, what does this have to do with me as a therapist, divorce. And I have had clients to come in and ask me to write a letter or to offer some type of support regarding their file, and I had to tell them based off of previous experience, supervision, what I would have to do and what that looks like. And so as a young marriage family therapist, you have to be very careful about what you need to do. All right. Anyway, it's important that a therapist in this role should understand how important good documentation is, and a therapist in this role can also assist in many ways, as can the therapist's clients with his or her attorney. You can work with them. However, the attorney represents the client and not us. And so there are certain protectors that you as a therapist have to put in place so that you're not compromising their privacy or your profession or your licensure. So you really want to be careful. And we're going to talk about what does it mean to be subpoenaed and all those type of things. And what do you do when it comes to releasing information when you are subpoenaed? And so some of those things are you really have to be careful. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I only have a few minutes to talk, and I've already kind of shared quite a bit. All right, so I want to talk about the AAMFT, what they talk about. I'm pulling up some of the forms here. One of the things they talk about, they said that there are clinical assessment tools that we could use There are some pretty interesting ones that will help to determine, when it comes to child custody, who's fit to raise the children. And I found out that there are some differences in who's who and what can be done as far as raising children. And as far as child care protection, there are what they call where parents where sometimes there can be a conservator or who functions like a child fiduciary who makes sure that the children they're in charge of selling and transferring, dividing, or otherwise managing the minors, a child's property. Now, the AAMFT talks about providing care with minors, and we have to be very careful that when we help them, I think there is a point where you have to be careful to have a certain authorization to represent children who are younger than 18 years old. And so the child custody and divorce is let me see here, where did I find that? I'm sorry. According to the child custody, the tools needed to no, that's not where I wanted to go. Hold on. Okay. I'm sorry, I thought I had it here. But I believe that children, if you're going to represent them, they have to be a certain age. If they're underage or representing minors, the AAMFT actually talks about providing counsel to them and having the consent to do so. Now, when we look at child custody visitation, it can be negotiated and established calmly with the understanding and agreement, thus decreasing the stress and confusion for the child. And overall family functioning is also affected during this child custody negotiation. In other words, they have all kinds of evaluation tools like the BBRS, which is let me see here. They got hold on. They have all kinds of tests here. Ooh. They have like the behavior assessment for children, which is the BASC, the BASC. They use that. They also have the comprehensive behavior rating scale, and that's where they evaluate that. They have assessment tools that will also that can be used to evaluate children and adolescents, including drawings, board games, reports of close relatives, teachers, and understanding of how these issues develop, what led them to this system, how did they get involved. But anyway, there are just so many different things that we could talk about here. The AAMFT Code of Ethics is very clear about the therapist's role and what we can do in their scenario and how we can help them. It's very important that therapists realize that that if you're subpoenaed and you're asked to provide information, that you can be utilized or weaponized for one client versus the other, and you have to just be careful. You can even end your term of service with your client and make that rule up front. Let them know up front what the risks are by providing their information, letting them know that that whatever they share with you, that it could be brought back up. You can let them know that it could be, shared with outside people. However, if a subpoena is ordered, as a therapist, there are some protections in place that would allow me to summarize my documentation, and I can even set up policies within my practice that would allow me to destroy or to get rid of notes that doesn't really relate to the primary issue at hand. And then even whatever I submit to the courts, I can actually submit it with certain limitations and stuff like that. So in this short video, there are so many rules and so many things you could learn dealing with children and divorce. And again, the general process is a little difficult. Child custody is a very fragile thing, and therapists can play a major role in helping families to come to that conclusion. And of course, as therapists, good documentation, good record keeping, and even just utilizing there's a host of assessment tools that we could use. And again, I found an article that offered a lot of resources as far as what those tools are. And as I said, there are several. I couldn't call it off by name, but there are several tools that you could use to utilize to help with that process. And consideration for evaluation is custody of evaluating custody and arrangements for them. Remember, the mental health provider has to understand his roles, and the AAMFT provides some really good information. But there are other resources that help therapist professionals. Now, as a student, as a resident, I'm still learning a lot of those things. And the tips for releasing information when subpoena. Again, I found a wonderful article here, and I'll just show you this real quick. And this is a really great article that I found that does a really good job. And I have my notes highlighted here, but this is a really good book. I plan on actually buying this and adding this to my library of stuff that I will be using as I work with clients and stuff. But it's called Roles for the Therapist in Divorce and Custody Proceedings and Important Legal Considerations. And so it just offers a lot of information. This week's reading required me to dig and to find additional resources. And like I said, I was worried about 15 minutes, but as you can see, the 15 minutes are up. And I have to bring this discussion to a close. And I do apologize for any stammering, but there is just so much information about how we can help families. And ultimately, divorce doesn't just impact the couples, it impacts the whole family. And when we're providing care for the whole family, we're actually helping everyone. And that includes even their caregivers, who sometimes are allowed to work with therapists once the child has been placed, or once a child has been liberated from a hostage system, which basically requires a parent an opportunity to work on themselves while the child is in foster care. And if the child is taken out of foster care, if the mother or the father who's dealing with substance abuse cannot break free on their track, if they can't get their track together, then the child is further pushed down into the system, and ultimately the parent loses their rights. Or maybe they'll do well and get the child back, but therapists play a major role in that process. And so there is just a wide opening for opportunities to continue to practice what you do. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation. Have a good one. This is Johnnie Porter signing off.